So now let's jump into our next unit, Expansionism, Imperialism, and World War One. So once we are feeling more fiscally sound here at home, we start to look at other places that we can start to sell our products. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is expansionism. So the roots of imperialism, you have to understand that up until the late 1800s, the United States had mostly followed an isolationist ideal. All right, isolationism is this idea that we avoid entanglements with foreign countries. Like, the only time we'd ever even remotely kind of dealt with foreign policy was the Monroe Doctrine, if you remember, when we pretty much said, Europe, you stay where you are, we'll stay where we are, but if you come over here and try to mess with, Latin America at that time is what they were referring to, we'll fight back. But by the 1880s, that had really begun to change, and European powers had already been pursuing imperialism throughout the world. Imperialism is a policy of exerting economic, political, or military control over weaker nations. And like I said, trade really plays a big role in this shifting view of foreign policy. We are making all these products now, since we've industrialized. Now we need to find somewhere to sell them. So this leads to this idea of expansionism. It's a policy that's very similar to imperialism, and it's focused on a country's territory, or increasing a country's territory in hopes of opening new markets for American products, and providing access to raw materials that we can use in our factories to build products. European powers had been doing this already at this point by about 50 years. They'd already carved up Africa and Asia pretty much for themselves, and they added colonies and what they called protectorates, which are essentially countries that are partly controlled by those stronger countries. For example, you have places like India and South Africa that become protectorates under the European imperialism. Well, we have this U.S. naval officer named Alfred T. Mahan, and he proposed an international network of naval bases with a powerful battleship fleet, and he proposed aggressive foreign policy. And really, the cornerstone of imperialism and expansionism is racism. So white English speakers are seen to be superior, and the rest of the world should bend to their will. America starts its expansionist journey by looking at Alaska and Hawaii. In 1867, the U.S. paid $7.2 million to purchase Alaska from Russia. It becomes actually known as Seward's Folly. People thought the land was useless, but eventually they realized Seward had been pretty smart because they find gold. The salmon fishing industry takes off, copper is discovered. Alaska, still to this day, is a very important source for energy, materials, those kinds of things. Hawaii, which is an archipelago or an island chain, as I hope you know by this point. And missionaries had actually begun preaching there in the 1800s. Sugarcane and pineapple plantations began to grow and export, and it became a strategic area to put a naval base. So American influence really began to grow, and this begins to spark conflict. Hawaii had a monarchy, and in 1891, Queen Liliuokalani came to power, and she dismissed the legislature that had been created. She presented a new constitution that essentially stripped powers from the white settlers, mostly Americans, and it gave more support and power back to the native Hawaiians. Americans that were living there, pro-American Hawaiians, and 150 U.S. Marines staged a revolt against Queen Liliuokalani. They overthrew her monarchy, they established their own government, and the United States annexed, or as we call it, took possession of the islands. President Benjamin Harrison agreed and signed this treaty with the pro-Americans, and it was supposed to go into effect February 14th of 1893. But it's hard to enforce when you lost the election to Grover Cleveland in 1892. And so Grover Cleveland didn't support the treaty, and so it kind of just floundered. In 1898, though, the United States does formally annex Hawaii, and in 1900, the Organic Act is passed, which established American-style government in Hawaii, and it became a U.S. territory. So we've got Hawaii, we've got Alaska, we need to continue to extend our influence, and so we look to Asia. The United States was actually pretty well established by this point. Naval Commodore Matthew Perry had negotiated the Treaty of Kanagawa with Japan in 1854. Japan had also been very isolationist for centuries. That's why they're called a monoculture. They don't have a lot of mixing of races or anything like that. They had always kind of stayed to themselves. Well, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry was sent to negotiate diplomatic relationships between Japan and the United States, and Japan formally opens its ports to American ships. And so the U.S. began to turn its focus to China, as we now had a location in the Pacific closer. Great Britain had the strongest presence in China, but there were other European countries there as well. France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and even Japan, and they had all carved out what they call spheres of influences, which are claims of exclusive economic and trading authority in parts of the country. And within each sphere, nations made deals with local banks and businesses, and the United States wanted a piece of the pie. We wanted a part of that. So in 1900, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Hay, proposed the open door policy. This was a proposal aimed to establish equal access to ports among countries trading with China. Now, this calmed the Chinese fears that shifting competition between foreign powers would change the spheres of influences. However, a lot of the Chinese were really fed up with foreign interference and meddling in their country. So this leads to what becomes known as the Boxer Rebellion. There's a group that is established as a secret society called the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, and they opposed the presence of Westerners and the Japanese, and they really resented Christian missionaries. There were bands of rebels, and they began attacking foreigners, and they were mostly attacking missionaries, and they earned the name of the Boxers. They also attacked Chinese leaders that they believed were responsible for this preferential treatment to these foreign countries rather than to China. It became known as the Boxer Rebellion, which is a 1900 political uprising in northern China against foreigners in the country. In 1898, Chinese government began calling for an end to foreign meddling, and the Boxers changed their names to the Righteous and Harmonious Militia. The government enlisted this militia and encouraged its violence against foreigners. They burned Christian churches and buildings that housed foreign businesses, and they even attacked Beijing. International relief forces finally arrive and they stop the violence. China's empress sends troops to fight the relief forces and declare war against the US, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Japan, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Beijing is captured by those international forces in August of 1900, and the empress and her court escape the city and really didn't have any part of the negotiations that do happen. In September of 1901, China signs a treaty that officially ended the Boxer Rebellion, and China was forced to pay reparations, or a form of compensation to the foreign powers that had to go in and fight. It had a disastrous effect on the Chinese economy and actually made them more dependent on those foreign powers. So we're now looking at Asia, and we have a lot of places nearer to us that we can send products to and get raw materials from. And Spain at the time is an empire in decline. They had lost most of the lands they'd had. They had a few colonies left. Mostly it was small islands like Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines in the Pacific. Well, in February of 1895, seeing Spain weakening, Cuba revolts. Spain couldn't defeat the rebels in battle, and so they actually turned to really brutal tactics. They herded citizens into fortified camps, so they couldn't help the rebels. Camps were disease-ridden and overcrowded. 100,000 Cubans died of starvation in these camps. So America began to take an interest in this. And there's a few reasons. The island is only 90 miles away from the Key West in Florida. It also had economic interests. American companies were heavily invested in the sugarcane plantations that existed there. And the U.S. accounted for 85% of Cuba's exports. We also identified with Cubans because we, at one point, desired our independence as well, and we kind of saw ourselves as this beacon to help with that. So in 1897, William McKinley becomes president, and Americans really wanted the government to intervene in what was happening in Cuba. McKinley attempted to negotiate before full-on war. Spain offered the Cubans limited self-government, and it kind of appeased everybody. February of 1898, the U.S. had a Navy battleship, the USS Maine, sent to Havana Harbor. Well, on the 15th of February, it exploded out in the harbor, and it killed more than 250 American servicemen, to about two-thirds of the crew. Research today has suggested that it was a naturally occurring chemical reaction in one of the bunkers that had caused this explosion, but at the time, a naval board of inquiry and the American public blamed Spain. And it was strongly supported by yellow journalism, which is a type of sensationalized news writing. This is where a lot of these, we talk about the headlines being deceptive. It really begins around this time. And so they are calling for Remember the Maine. Became the rallying cry, kind of like Remember the Alamo, right? And so Americans increasingly begin to favor war with Spain. Congress gave McKinley the authority to use force, and Spain declared war against the United States on April 24th, 1898, and the U.S. declared war on Spain the following day on the 25th. But the first battle of the Spanish-American War doesn't actually happen in Cuba. It happens in the Philippines. And the Philippines is an island chain located in the Pacific. And the U.S. Navy believed that if they could easily defeat the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, and they could take control. Spain had already been battling rebels there for a while, and those rebels actually joined forces with the Americans to kick Spain out of there. So on May 1st, 1898, Commodore George Dewey led the Navy in an attack against the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. And within hours, the Spanish fleet was destroyed. The U.S. had 6 steel ships, the Spanish had 7 wooden ships. There's no comparison, right? It's bringing a knife to a gunfight, essentially. 0 Americans lost their lives that day. 350 Spanish soldiers lost their lives. Even with this victory, Dewey didn't have the troops to take Manila, which is the capital. But with reinforcements, he succeeded at this by August. During peacetime following the Civil War, the U.S. Army had really decreased its numbers. It is a really modern thing, really post-World War II thing to have a large military all the time. And so to fight in the Spanish-American War, they needed more than those 25,000 troops. When they sent out the call for troops, over 1 million men volunteered, while only about 280,000 of them actually saw active duty. In June 1898, the war in the Caribbean really began. Troops landed at Guantanamo Bay in Santiago in Cuba. And on July 1st, the Battle of San Juan Hill, which is the most famous battle of the war, begins. The Rough Riders, which were a volunteer cavalry regiment, and 2 African-American regiments charged up Kettle Hill while other units attacked at San Juan Hill. And the Rough Riders are really well known because they were led by Teddy Roosevelt. He had been the Secretary of the Navy, and he actually resigned as Secretary of the Navy so he could go lead this unit and fight. He becomes portrayed as a hero, and this really helps him later become President of the United States. When the war broke out, the U.S. Army included 4 regiments of African-American soldiers. They had been stationed out in the West, taking care of kind of the Indian situation that was going on out there. They had to travel through the South to get to their deployment locations along the Gulf Coast. And while they're going through the South, they experienced segregation and racial threats. And even with all of that, they fought bravely and valiantly and with distinction, many of them earning medals of honor. The war ends pretty quickly. The Spanish Navy is destroyed fleeing Santiago, and they surrendered July 16, 1898. American troops took control of Puerto Rico on July 25th, and a ceasefire was signed August 12th, and the entire war had only lasted 16 weeks. Here's another Treaty of Paris that is created, and in this Treaty of Paris, Cuba is going to be an independent country. The U.S. gains the territories of Puerto Rico and Guam. We buy the Philippines for $20 million, and we leased Guantanamo Bay from Cuba for a naval base.